a world hungry for change, nonprofit impact matters more than ever. Yet every day, you're asked to do more with less. Less time, fewer resources, and tools that weren't even built for the way nonprofits actually work. What if you could do more with more? That's the promise of Bloomerang, the giving platform built for purpose. Bloomerang integrates fundraising, donor, and volunteer management into one intuitive platform. It connects your data to reveal real opportunity, showing you who's ready to give, when to reach out, and how to deepen every relationship. Because when your tools are built for purpose, your mission goes further. More connection, more confidence, more impact. Now that's more like it. Learn how you can do more with more at bloomerang.com. That's bloomerang.com. Now on to the show. Hello, and welcome to Nonprofit Nation. I'm your host, Julia Campbell, and I'm going to sit down with nonprofit industry experts, fundraisers, marketers, and everyone in between to get real and discuss what it takes to build that movement that you've been dreaming of. I created the Nonprofit Nation podcast to share practical wisdom and strategies to help you confidently find your voice, definitively grow your audience, and effectively build your movement. If you're a nonprofit newbie or an experienced professional who's looking to get more visibility, reach more people, and create even more impact, then you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hello, everyone. This is Nonprofit Nation with your host, Julia Campbell. Today, we're talking about how nonprofits can show up when their communities are grieving and fearful and demanding accountability. And we know that nonprofit leaders are called upon to do much more than deliver services. We have to communicate with empathy. We have to support our teams. We have to stand alongside our communities. And we have to decide whether or how to speak publicly about events that are unfolding in real time. So today I'm joined by Jacques Hebert, Communications Director at the McKnight Foundation. And we're going to talk all about his approach, the McKnight Foundation's approach, and what the approach should be for the sector and for philanthropy going forward in these unprecedented times. We keep saying unprecedented times. Have there been precedented times? I don't think so.
If you can tell me when,
I know.
Let's go back to there for a little bit and just experience it for even a few minutes. I think our nervous systems could all use it.
Can you tell us a bit about your story, your sort of journey and your work at the McKnight Foundation?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much, Julia, for having me on. And thank you for the podcast. It's so important, that we have a space to connect with each other and talk about these important issues. So as you mentioned, I'm Communications Director at the McKnight Foundation. We're nearly 75-year-old family foundation based in Minneapolis. We work across all of Minnesota and across the Midwest, and even have a global foods program that's working outside of the U.S. We focus in a number of areas, but largely focused on climate, on economic opportunity, arts, culture, and more. So, my background in coming to McKnight, I had never worked in philanthropy prior to this position. Communications has really been a through line for me from the beginning. So started my career at a large tech corporation, working in kind of a more traditional corporate communication space. Actually worked at YouTube, helping people communicate about how they could make careers on YouTube and produce all kinds of content, which was amazing, to think about when that was, like back in 2012. Now you think about TikTok and just where people are in terms of the creator ecosystem. Mm-hmm. But long story short, I quickly learned in that experience that I loved communications. I loved telling stories. And I also loved mission-driven work. So that caused me...
Same.
Yeah. I did a rapid turn in my career to go from a large corporation to a nonprofit news organization. And from there, I kind of continued my path. Born and raised, I've lived all over, but I was born and raised south of New Orleans. A lot of people say, what is south of New Orleans? But it was a really kind of rural coast community that at the time had been devastated by, Hurricane Katrina and then the BP oil spill. I was living in California and just felt really compelled to go back home and help my people. So I was fortunate enough to get a position working with the National Audubon Society and then Environmental Defense Fund, two nonprofits that were working with a number of state-based nonprofits in Louisiana to help the region recover and address long-term impacts to climate change and other disasters. It was then that I really leaned into the power of storytelling and had the opportunity, to sometimes I would go out on boats or seaplanes with New York Times reporters or others to help them see what was happening to Louisiana's coast and its people rather than trying to tell them through words.
So much
and
more
then
powerful.
I made my way to Minnesota, as many people in Minnesota do. I married someone from Minnesota. My husband, felt the calling to come back. And Minnesotans are known to do that. They love their place and they love bringing people back with them. So have been in Minnesota for about 5 years, was here, the McKnight position opened up. And for me, it was an incredible opportunity to be at the confluence of so many areas that I had worked, whether that's in the environment, whether that's arts and culture, whether that's on opportunity. And then it's just been a tremendous 3 years here at the McKnight Foundation. I consider myself proud every day to come and work on the mission that we work on and kind of support and help amplify the stories of the incredible partners and nonprofits that are working in Minnesota and beyond to do some really important things for our people. So that's a little bit about me.
Oh, that's so great. No, I really appreciate that. And I had reached out to the McKnight Foundation after seeing the really powerful public statements that the foundation made, that McKnight President Tanya Allen made following Renee Good's shooting almost immediately after. And I was struck by it because I hadn't see a lot of people posting about it in the sector. I didn't see a lot of organizations. I didn't see a lot of foundations posting about it. And something that really struck me about the statement is when Tanya wrote, we believe in dignity, safety, and the rule of law. We will not accept the unjust targeting of our immigrant neighbors that rips families apart, government overreach that undermines constitutional rights, or violence and the senseless loss of life. I just thought that statement was incredibly powerful and needed. How did you make this decision? I'm not sure if it was a tough decision. Maybe it was a very easy decision to make this kind of statement. I know a lot of nonprofit leaders might struggle to come out so strongly after such a polarizing, which should not have been a polarizing event, but after such an event that kind of ripped people apart, especially on social media.
First, I'll just say and acknowledge we're here in early March in Minnesota. The last 2.5 months, the nation saw this firsthand, have just been so devastating for so many people. Of course, we've had our neighbors and, people in our places of worship or work or at schools who have been removed, right? And they're, no longer part of their community. The families have been separated. We've had businesses, particularly immigrant-owned businesses and small businesses throughout the region that have, had to shutter their doors, that are struggling to get by because of their employees can't come to work or they're scared to open their doors. You have families that have not been able to go to work for a number of reasons or out of fear. That are now facing, back rent or mortgage payments and are at risk at being evicted. So what we're experiencing in Minnesota is far from over, and the long-term impacts will continue. Our president, Tanya Allen, has shared that this is like COVID 2.0, but without government assistance and because of government provocation. So putting that out because I think it's important as the headlines move on, people realize what has been left here in Minnesota and the needs that exist to really support people through that. So McKnight, is trying to do our part, directing more resources to support families, to support small businesses in addition to our existing grant making. And there are many others who are stepping up in the process. But I would just say, in terms of the specific statement you referenced that Tanya put out, McKnight has had a long time orientation as a foundation, really going back to Tanya's coming to the foundation, that there are many ways that we as an organization can advance our mission. Of course, our grant making and the ways that we support nonprofit organizations to do critical work on a whole range of issues that benefit people, that's central. But foundations have other tools, and many nonprofit organizations have them too, right? So one of those is our public voice and the ways that we use our voice to inspire, to influence, to inform others. And we take that charge very seriously. Really going back to the beginning of last year, 2025, folks might remember it was a time of rapid change. There was a lot of confusion, a lot of swirl, a lot of fear coming out, and that was blanketing, the nonprofit sector, the philanthropic sector. I mean, frankly, every sector of our society. We saw law firms, we saw large media corporations, academic institutions, all kind of capitulating or saying like, we can't say anything, we can't do anything, we have to kind of keep our heads down and just keep moving. At the time, McKnight made a decision that like, look, we're going to be really clear about what we stand for. And that is we stand for our mission to advance a more just, creative, and abundant future where people and planet thrive. We stand for our values as an institution, and we stand for our partners, right? Essentially the people, whether that's nonprofits, whether that's our neighbors, who are doing incredible work, who are just trying to show up every day and improve the lives of others. And we issued that statement in February. It was at a time when I think very few foundations had said anything publicly.
Oh, it was complete radio silence.
Yeah. I'll give credit to, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which had a very strong statement. I believe the California Endowment. But we issued that statement, and there we were, at the time, we're like sort of fearful doing it. We're like, is this going to create backlash? What impact is this going to have on us? Looking back, it's like, this is crazy. This is America. This is our society. We have a right to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and to stand up for our values and the important work that we're doing. So I just name that because I think that kicked off for us a sense of clarity in our communications and our public voice and in how we're showing up in this moment of challenge that then resulted in, when that devastating moment happened, we were in a meeting and I got a news alert saying that one of our neighbors, a person had been shot in South Minneapolis. And this is just less than 10 minutes from our office. Sadly, it's blocks away from where George Floyd was murdered in 2020. We worked quickly to assess what information do we know? What can we understand about the situation? We didn't want to get out in a place where we're communicating before we had the facts, before we knew the context. But once we knew that, because we had been clear about our values, we had been clear about where we stood as a foundation, ultimately, this was just standing up for and being clear about this was an American citizen, a mom, someone who was exercising constitutional rights, and no one should be faced with that kind of devastating consequences. And then, of course, only weeks later, we saw basically the same thing happened to Alex Preddy, right? And I'll just say that stepping back from that immediate moment, which, was so painful, and, it was really important that we spoke out, expressed deep condolences for the wife of Renee Good, her family, and the broader community that was seeing this in horror and wondering, like, is this okay? What is happening? And also making sure that those outside of Minnesota were aware of what was happening as well. There were weeks early in, the surge, particularly late December, January, where there was so much intensity that was happening here. I mean, I don't think people really can understand. It was affecting every part of our society. People who work here, people who we know, our loved ones, our friends, were all deeply impacted. There was no escaping it. And at the same time, unless you were here, it felt like, is anyone paying attention? Does anyone know really what's happening here? It was this sense of both like, this is not normal. Are we living in America? And where is everyone? Where is the outrage? And are people just even aware of what's happening? I think because of all of the devastation and the work that was done to document, to showcase to the world in very clear terms what was happening. I mean, there was no mistaking it. And then people really started to activate and respond. But there was that period where it felt like we were alone. And so for us, making the decision to speak out was making the decision to showcase what was happening here, to be a part of telling the story, to be a part of documenting, to be a part of calling others in to support our neighbors and people who were impacted. And then one thing I'll just say to this specific question. So, it wasn't necessarily, when this happened, it wasn't necessarily, the intensity, the volume was something unlike we had seen anywhere else in any other American city or community. That this was happening wasn't necessarily a huge surprise. We had nonprofit partners who have been doing incredible work to educate people about their rights, their legal rights, their constitutional rights, to educate them about how to be constitutional observers. So these trainings really, thousands and thousands of people have gone to them. But they essentially train people on the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution.
Right. And then if that's not being followed, if that's being thrown out the window, what do you do?
They emphasize de-escalation, nonviolence, and essentially keeping a distance, right? And just recording with your phone so that can be documented, if families need to be informed for other reasons. But those videos, that documentation became so important to the world seeing what was happening. And I raised that because once we started to hear, and this is back in late 2025, November, December, that this was a likelihood that this could happen here. We had seen what had happened in Chicago. We had seen what had happened in Los Angeles, New Orleans, where I'm from. One of the things that we did as an organization, myself, some of our senior leaders, was just to map out what is our position? Like, how do we get ready on a number of fronts? And what is our position? What is our narrative about this? And essentially we said, look, we're for law and order. We are for the rule of law. We think everyone should follow the law, whether that's people who come here or the people who are enforced and charged with keeping us safe. And we emphasized humanity. We emphasized dignity. We emphasized the fact that we know that our immigrant and refugee neighbors make us stronger as a state, as a community. They're people that we love and care for. And I think having that shared and aligned narrative early allowed us to move quickly in the events that then happened, right? Including the ones that you referenced. And so I would just encourage your listeners to think about that. The unprecedentedness keeps happening to the point where is unprecedented even a word that is relevant anymore, right? But
chaotic. I don't know what's a better word.
Yes. But in this, we talk about VUCA, the volatile, uncertain, I don't even know what the rest stands for. But in this world, you have to have that sense of like readiness, if not for the specific scenario, at least at a general level. Like, what would be your principles for moving through this uncertainty or this chaos? What are the things that are important for you to really lean into and say and emphasize as an organization that's grounded in your mission, that's grounded in who you are? And so I would just encourage people to think about that as part of the preparedness and just being ready to communicate when you need to communicate.
Exactly. First of all, VUCA, I just looked it up. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity.
Thank you. Yes.
Exactly where we are right now. Thank you for sharing that experience, because I do think it's so important for people to understand what it was really like in Minnesota and Minneapolis and how it affected every single person and every single business and across sectors and across industries. I did want to say to those listening, McKnight actually has a really great resource if you do want to support Minnesotans, if you want to share on social media, if you want to learn more resources, it's mcknight.org/best-of-MN. And I will put that in the show notes if you're looking for some ways to really support everyday Minnesotans and people that are getting back on their feet. So I'm just thinking about everything that you said. As a communications director, you know that your job is to be proactive, right? It is to mobilize people and we got to get out a statement and we got to do this. How did you manage that personally, mentally? I think that's something that a lot of nonprofits struggle with as well. I'm not in Minnesota, but when I saw that Renee Good was shot, I had to lay down and cry. I'm in Boston, but as a mother, as someone, that really believes in our democracy or did, I'm not sure, but it really affected me personally. what is some advice that you would have for communications directors maybe dealing with a crisis like this that affects them so personally, but you still being able to get the word out because it's so important, the visibility?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, thank you for asking that question. And I think it's part of a broader, we have to more broadly recognize that so many people that work in the nonprofit space, whether they're in communications, regardless of what they're doing, we're part of our community, right? We communicated about what was happening here because it was happening here to our people, to our neighbors. But with that also comes the weight, right? And so I think recognizing that, I personally, compared to many people who have gone through the last 2 months, have been in a fine position. Yes, it's been hard to see what is happening in our community, to see what's happening to neighbors and people we care about. And I've also felt very intensely motivated and purpose-driven to do what I could with my role, my capabilities to help, right? And you have to balance that, sometimes it's also all-consuming. So there are multiple things that are true at the same time. I would say that, having your core and having your grounding and knowing when you need to kind of separate and step back and listening to yourself, right? So for me, having time to be with my family, having time to be with my friends, even picking up the phone and calling, a family member who lives in another state to just be let me just get this out and tell you what is happening here because I just need someone else to understand it. I think knowing what kind of grounds you in a moment and being willing to go there, being willing to set the right kind of boundaries so that you're caring for yourself through it all. But I would say this, I also am thinking about caring for my team. I'm also thinking about caring for our organization, along with our leadership at McKnight. And that's where it's really important to think about you balancing the external with the internal, right? And what are you communicating? How are you connecting with your people internally? And knowing and I'll just be really blunt, I have friends that work at different corporations and other places in the Twin Cities who were going through the same thing I was going through. They didn't hear one thing from their employer. There was very little acknowledgement until much later in the whole situation. I would say McKnight, when everything happened initially and there was the murder of Renee Good, first thing that we did for our staff was to just create a space for us to come together and just process together, right? Because we recognized this is directly impacting us. It's right in our community. It's something that's very shocking that we work on, we're dealing with. And just creating that space for acknowledgement, for seeing each other, the people that wanted to participate. And then were we also flexible in terms of providing resources to staff to navigate the moment? So I would encourage leadership that's listening and others to think about, what we're going through. We learned what VUCA stands for. We've also used the term polycrisis, right? Which we have to be able to sustain ourselves as a sector. And there's a lot that I could say, and I'm not an expert in meditation or wellness, but I think those resources is so important. And just the acknowledgement comes first. That we're human and we're caring a lot. And often the people that are drawn to nonprofit mission-driven work are the ones that are going to care most about what's happening in the world. And what's happening in the world right now is a lot of difficult stuff. The last thing I would say is it's so important to lean into and prioritize the good. And so I was also very proud over the last 2 months. And that's why the page that you highlighted is called Best of Minnesota, because one of the things that emerged from the darkest of circumstances and the most challenging of circumstances, people that were showing up as the best of Minnesota and the best of America, right? And this was people who said, I'm going to go out in the freezing cold of a Minnesota winter, negative, 25-degree wind chill, and I'm going to stand watch outside of this school so that these kids can safely get into class and learn. Right. I'm going to, and so many people did that. I mean, I have a neighbor she's retired. She's in her 70s. She's like, I just need to do something. I'm going to organize and coordinate carpools for kids so that they can go to school because their parents are too scared to leave. You had people that, were doing the Constitutional Observer work, which was so vital. You had people that were delivering groceries on a constant basis to others who were stuck in their homes and they couldn't go out. Small businesses. I mean, one of the things we worked with, W. Kamau Bell, who folks may know, is a well-known kind of producer, director, comedian, and he was just like interested in coming to Minnesota and sharing stories. He met with a local business owner named Amar, who owns One Stop Shop in South Minneapolis. His business was largely frequented by like Latino customers, many of whom were, not coming because they couldn't leave their homes. His business was struggling. And at the same time, he said like, well, I'm going to do what I can to support these people. I'm going to deliver groceries. And if they can't pay, I'm still going to help them out and get them what they need. Kamau did a story about him, and it quickly went viral. And then people from all over the country were just saying, like, how can I help? Because I think they were inspired. They saw just the basic goodness, the basic decency, the basic care. And that's what the world saw in Minnesota. And so being able to focus on that among all of the hardships, the negativity, and just represent how Minnesota and Minnesotans were showing up was such a source of pride, inspiration, motivation, and energy that like allowed me and probably so many other people that were going through this to just get through it. And so I would say we, showed the country what it means to stand up for our neighbors, for our democracy, and what that should be. And I think very proud of that here in Minnesota, and hope folks in other places were watching and listening, because that's kind of what's needed if we're going to get through this together.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I remember my social media feed went from horrifying images of ICE agents pulling people out of cars and out of schools and taking children. And then it kind of went from in the weeks afterwards, people helping, like you just said, like a woman that just wanted to start a carpool or standing outside of a school or, grocery store owner. And I thought it was just so striking and amazing and wonderful to see, the community stepping up like that. I think for nonprofits, communication directors especially, they really struggle with how to say something and when to say something. And I saw this, and I'm sure you saw this with George Floyd. So it seems like if you are living in Minneapolis, you are going to be commenting and saying something about what happened with the murder of George Floyd. But I saw so many organizations where I live in Boston struggle because they thought, well, I don't live there. I don't know enough about it. I'm not an expert on it. Like, what if I get it wrong? What if I get the words wrong? What if it looks performative? What if we get backlash? I mean, there's so many questions. Would you have advice on maybe how to create or what kind of framework you use when deciding when and how to speak on things that might not directly affect your community, and things maybe that are big, broader issues?
I think it's an important question, right? And so many organizations, nonprofits, corporations, others are struggling with this right now.
Yes.
I think one thing that's important to just acknowledge up front is that using your voice and using your platforms and positions really matters. And I think it matters right now when, so many people have been told, to obey in advance, that they need to, that if they say something, if they do something, it could risk a whole range of impacts. And frankly, let's lean into our constitutional rights and our First Amendment freedoms as a nation that, have been long fought for, to say that, actually we have that right, and let's use it. But to answer your question, I think using it in the right way is an important conversation. And you, as a communications director, or maybe a nonprofit leader, you should have that conversation in advance of when you need to, right? So whether that's with your leadership team, whether that's getting input from staff, whether that's a conversation with your board, I think making sure that you're not avoiding the hard conversation and actually directly addressing it before you need to is going to help tremendously, right? Because you'll have a better sense of your aptitude, some might say risk tolerance, and also what is your positioning? What do you want to say that's grounded in who you are as an organization, your mission, and all of those sorts of things. As far as frameworks, because this is something that comes up for us all the time, should we communicate about this? Should we communicate about that? If not this, then why? I think a lot of people get requests from people within their organization saying, well, I saw this thing happen. Like, should we communicate on it? And it's also real that like while using your voice and your public voice matters, so does like when you use it, and communications teams could be absorbed with just trying to respond to and communicate about everything that's happening in the world. So the way we've kind of organized it, I have like this framework that I created that just kind of helps ground us, which is I call the 5 Ps. So it's people, like, is this affecting your staff? Is this affecting your close partners? Place, is this something that's happening in your place? Like, and for example, for us, it would be in the Twin Cities or in Minnesota or a place that we work, even globally. Priorities, right? Is this something that ties into your strategic priorities as an organization? Precedence, is there a precedence for communicating about this in the past, or do you want to set that precedence, right, going forward? Because I think one of the things that we've seen is, people will use their voice, they'll say something, they'll issue a statement, but then sometimes that requires follow through, right? Sometimes that requires, action. So understanding the precedence question is really important. And then the last one, which is important, and I think this is where you need to, like, do you have a point of view? Do you have something you want to add to the conversation that's based in your expertise, that's based in your experience and your understanding, that's based in the work that you do? Or are you just trying to like add, to the noise? And I'm not saying like all of those, I would weigh all of those equally, right? If something was like directly impacting our people and our priorities, right? Or it was happening in our place, but maybe we haven't said anything about it in the past, or maybe we don't necessarily have a strong point of view. We probably should do it, but we need to figure out what our point of view is, right? So I'm not saying this is like a perfect framework, but it at least allows you to kind of have some of those conversations. And as a communicator, a lot of times, we'll get, well, we should say something about this. Okay, well, what do we want to say? What do we need to say? And so it gives you that sense of grounding of, maybe what you need to say right now is just more of a message of affirmation for your people. And maybe it's an internal message, right? Because it really is just about what's happening like to staff. It's not something, maybe you don't need to do a public announcement about it. Or maybe it's just, so it kind of guides you. But I would say having the conversation up front, I think also knowing that kind of what I shared before, organizations are comprised of people, right? Like they are both like people that come into work every day that have a whole range of experiences, that are seeing all these headlines. Sometimes they just need the acknowledgement that like, what they're experiencing is being seen. And then organizations, a lot of times, McKnight is a deeply place-based foundation. We have strong partnerships and relationships in our community. We consider ourselves to be a part of the community. We want to be a good neighbor. That means showing up for our community when our community needs us, right? And we've gotten tremendous feedback and positive feedback from so many people and places because of how we've been communicating. And I think part of that is because I don't want to say it's rare, but like there's been, I think, a backlash to and a retreat, I think, from what people's willingness to use their voice. So, and then the last thing I'll share is, especially if you have access to resources, right? So we're a foundation, right? We have our grant making. Yes, our public voice is important, but so is the action, right?
Yes.
So I think it's important whether you're a corporation, regardless. Using your voice, communicating, and statements are important, but that shouldn't be the end, right? That shouldn't be the finish line. That should be the starting point. Right. So what are you doing? What are you putting behind that statement? What are you putting behind your communications? How are you backing it up with action so that it doesn't become performative, that it doesn't become kind of a PR exercise? And I think making sure that whatever action you're doing is very clear in what you're saying, so people see and recognize that. So, it's a lot. Like, look, we're in a world where we're being inundated with information, where, it seems like there's a crisis on every corner. I think having that grounding as an institution and knowing who you are, knowing what really matters and what you can bring uniquely to the conversation is a good starting point to navigating the VUCA world.
So how can we support the work in Minnesota, and what's going on? Like, what's an update on the ground right now?
Thank you for that question. So, here we are in, it's March, early, almost mid-March. Since the initial drawdown was announced, I think a report that we heard last week was that there's still 650 agents that are currently deployed in Minnesota. We're hearing that, while things aren't as prevalent on the news and maybe there's not as much activity in the Twin Cities, there's still activity happening in suburban, communities or even rural communities. And then one thing I just really want to emphasize is, and I mentioned it earlier, but the long-term impacts are really significant, right? So, I mentioned impacts on families being able to pay rent and the fear of kind of eviction or people losing their homes. The University of Minnesota estimated that there's somewhere between 27 and 51 million in estimated excess rent debt. Just families that are really on the precipice of being potentially kicked out of their homes. I would say that is a critical and acute need. McKnight's working to do what we can to address it. Others can go to standwithminnesota.com.
Standwithminnesota.com.
Standwithminnesota.com. This is a site created by Ashley Fairbanks, who is a narrative communications leader, a fellow communications director. She's worked for the 100% Clean Energy campaign. She's from Minnesota. Yep. She's raised millions and millions and millions of dollars that's going direct to mutual aid support groups and direct to families. So that is a great resource. I can't say enough. That's one way to help. There's also business impacts. So long-term impacts to small businesses, both from lost profits as well as impacts to employees. There are groups that are working to support small businesses, including through loan programs, through relief programs. So that is another critical area. And then I would just emphasize the broader impacts are still to be felt. But one thing that's real that, maybe isn't talked about enough is just the mental health impacts of what has happened, particularly to our children, particularly to in our schools. There were people that were trapped in their homes for months on end. Many still are. There were youth. I'll never forget one of the most painful experiences, but also the reminders of what we're doing and why we're doing this. It was after the murder of Renee Good. Many of us gathered, like thousands and thousands of Minnesotans gathered for a protest on a Saturday in January. It was freezing cold. It was so orderly and organized by the group that brought it together. This was just people coming out with signs saying, like, I care about my neighbors. I care about my country. We marched from Powderhorn Park in South Minneapolis to the memorial of Renee Good. I was turning and I looked up on the street. I was walking in the middle of the street and I just saw these big houses and apartment complexes. And I saw up in the windows, the second, third floor, these little kids. They were like 6 years old, 5 years old, 10 years old, mostly like Latino looking children who were just looking down. And some of them had signs that said, "Thank you, Minnesota." They were waving,
The visual is so important
to children, right? Is significant. And so I think what has happened here should not happen anywhere else. I think there's a lot of work that's being done to highlight the amazing nonprofits, the amazing mutual aid and community leaders and constitutional observers who were on the front lines and still are on the front lines of responding and helping our neighbors and helping our communities. And not just over the last 2.5, 3 months. They've been doing it for years, right?
Right.
For their leadership, for their education, for their connection. But for that, we would have not gotten through what we got through. So I just want to lift up the leadership of our Minnesota nonprofits and many others who have been responding, our immigrant-led nonprofits, and just thank them so much because the work that they do is critical. And so anything we can do to support those organizations on our website that you mentioned, the Best of Minnesota, we have a list of many of those organizations that have been doing incredible work. But yeah, I would say it's so easy to just like move on to the next thing. We haven't moved on because we can't. And I think we all need to recognize what happened, but also be ready to stand up for our neighbors, to stand up for our democracy and uphold our First Amendment rights, and to lean into what Minnesota taught us, which is, essentially we're about care. We're about care. I think someone used the term, I think it was The Atlantic that said a new verb, neighboring, right? I mean, that's just really who we are. We care about our people. And I would say, these are people like it's grandmas, Minnesota grandmas who are showing up at the Lutheran church basement with a thing of lemon bars, just saying like, how can I help? I want to help, And so I think let's not forget that humanity and that still exists in all of us, despite what we may be told and what might be in our social media feeds.
Wow. I think everyone should be taking notes. I love that framework. And I also love the ending on hopeful notes. I always ask my guests what keep you hopeful. And you answered that really, really well. I think that does make me really hopeful as well. And I think the only thing more powerful than fear is hope and love, right? So that's all that we can do. So where can people go? McKnight.org. Can they connect with you on LinkedIn?
Yeah. Feel free to go to McKnight.org. You can learn more about our foundation and the work that we do. Feel free to look me up on LinkedIn at Jacques Hebert. There are a few of us, but I think if you look for Jacques Hebert and McKnight, you should be able to find me. And my page is also on the website. And then I'll just add one thing, Julia. Yes. Well, you mentioned our leader, Tanya Allen, who's the president of McKnight. And I mean, I think her leadership in this moment of the foundation has been so critical, right?
Yes.
She's seen and recognized the value and the power of communications in the many other ways that advances its mission. And, I just am so grateful to be able to work every day for a leader like Tanya Allen and would encourage those out there who, whether if you're not a communicator, but maybe you're a nonprofit president or, you work with communications teams, don't underestimate the power of communications and your communicators. I think I greatly appreciate the fact that I do work for an organization and a leader that understands the power there. But there's a lot that they do. They're experts. And so, you should treat them as such. And then I'll just end on this one hopeful quote that Tanya always shares that I love, but the future is not finished, right? And so I think it's important to acknowledge like we have a role in shaping the future. And, that's just how we try to show up every day. So I hope folks can feel that because sometimes it does feel like things are really heavy and they are, but we also have a role and we have power and we have agency in shaping the future.
Well, Jacques, thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for all the work that you're doing.
Of course, Julia. Thank you for having me. Thank you for, just being willing and caring about Minnesota and getting this message out. And thank you for this podcast and for what you're doing to lead, empower, and inform nonprofits.
Well, hey there. I wanted to say thank you for tuning into my show and for listening all the way to the end. If you really enjoyed today's conversation, make sure to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app, and you'll get new episodes downloaded as soon as they come out. I would love if you left me a rating or a review because this tells other people that my podcast is worth listening to. And then me and my guests can reach even more earbuds and create even more impact. So that's pretty much it. I'll be back soon with a brand new episode. But until then, you can find me on Instagram at JuliaCampbell77. Keep changing the world, you nonprofit unicorn.